Good evening. Good to see everyone this evening. We are continuing our study of how to interpret the Bible. Last week we talked about Bible background, and though we illustrated a little bit how that might help you, I thought it might be the case that you're still not totally confident or comfortable with what could that do for me. And so tonight we want to talk about first century life for the Jews. And you see that on the screen. So we'll begin with the synagogue. If you read the Old Testament, there's no synagogue. There's the Temple of Solomon. There's the temple that is the rebuilt version that comes a little later. And that's it. No synagogue mentioned in the Old Testament. And so what do we know about it? Well, because it certainly is there in the life of Jesus and in the life of the apostles. So Roy Bowen Ward wrote this: the synagogue served as the center of the various Jewish communities. Life as a whole and all of life was the subject of religion. Gatherings on the Sabbath for Torah study and for prayer were especially sacred. But the educational and judicial functions of the synagogue belong also to an understanding of Jewish religion. In other words, it served as, yes, a meeting place to worship, but it's also served as almost a schoolhouse. Now, not schoolhouse in the sense that we're going to study math and science. No, schoolhouse in learning the Jewish system and understanding the rules there. The elders, the Jewish community was usually under the oversight of a council of elders. And you see a reference to that in Luke 7, verse 3, and also Luke chapter 8, verse 41. These elders were especially concerned with judicial affairs within the Jewish community and represented that community before the Romans. Now, I want you to think about this. The elders would be in the gate. And you see example of that, for example, in the book of Ruth, where now that goes back a good way, I grant you, prior to the time of the captivity, things like that. But you'll notice that the elders sit in the gate. You see reference to it in Proverbs chapter 31, where it talks about the husband of the virtuous woman. And that man will be known when he sits among the elders of the land. So they sat at the gate. They basically were the court, if you would, the courthouse for people. That's who they would go to. And by the way, the word elder, I've said this before, I'll say it again. It means just what you think it means. It means old man. Older man. And I've never totally understood why that the shepherds in a given congregation don't insist we call them shepherds. I don't want to be called an old man. I am an old man, but I don't want to be called one. All right, next let's look at the scribes, also sometimes called the lawyers in the New Testament. The Torah was first taught by the priests. By the first century, however, non-priestly teachers and scholars of the Torah, the scribes or the lawyers, in Hebrew, the Sopharim, the men of the book is what that means. And so in the Torah, the Torah is preeminently the first 5 books of the Old Testament. We don't talk about it that way. We call it the Pentateuch. But they studied in some detail because that includes the entire law of Moses. And so it's going to come up on a regular basis. Scribes can be seen in Jerusalem, in Judea, and in Galilee, and I've given you 3 different references there to that. In fact, they were vital in Babylon and throughout the dispersion, and that's according to Edersheim. If you ever want to read an interesting book that's just full of Bible background, you want to read Alfred Edersheim's book, The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah. And he'll introduce you to all kinds of things. that were true in that era. Not Bible, but still very interesting because it helps us understand the Bible. The scribes were exegetes and teachers of the law. Now remember, we talked about exegesis, and what is that? That's drawing everything out of a passage that is in there. I want you to imagine, to understand the concept, imagine a little child whose mama brings a Tupperware or some other type of container to the church building with Cheerios or something. And the child, starts working their way down. And of course, we meet longer than the child really wants to meet. And when they look down in there and reach for the very last one, that's an exegete. Drawing out everything that's in there is the idea. Only we're talking about not, of course, Cheerios. We're talking about the Word of God, getting everything out of it that it has to say. So the scribes performed that function. While often seen in association with the Pharisees, the scribes held an office as learned students, exegetes, and teachers of the law. In fact, Edersheim said they were the ultimate authority on all questions of faith and practice. Now, I want you to think about that in terms of the time when the lawyer came to Jesus and said, "What is the first and greatest commandment?" And what was Jesus' response? "How do you read it?" In other words, he studied it all the time, and he should have known. And he did know. He answered correctly. And that's what leads to the telling of the great parable about the Good Samaritan. Edersheim also noted that the scribes, along with the chief priests and elders, judged on ecclesiastical matters. The word ecclesia is the called out. And you need to be careful because the word is not just used for the New Testament church. Really, most of the time in the New Testament, when you see the word church, you're talking about the ecclesia, the called out. But the Hebrews were also called the called out. In fact, in Acts chapter 7, verse 38, we find Stephen talking about the church in the wilderness. And the word that's used, ecclesia, same word. So when we're talking about ecclesiastical matters, we're talking about matters relating to the assembly of the Jews, because that's who these fellas are. The scribes were learned men who preserved, copied, and expounded the law and the tradition, and gave you all kinds of different verses there, because guess who wrote it? J.W. McGarvey. If anybody's going to give you everything you can about think of on it, he'll do that. Unlike the scribes, Jesus taught with authority. In fact, you may remember at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew chapter 7, verse 29, that's the reason that the people are just astounded, because Jesus speaks with authority. Now you might think, well, didn't the scribes do that? Well, no. Instead, what they would do is they'd get up and somebody'd say, well, give us an answer to this question. And they'd say, well, this rabbi says X, and this rabbi says Y, and this rabbi says Z. And then they really don't tell you which one's right. They just relate all of that. Jesus was not that way. When Jesus talked about the law of Moses, he talked about not just the law, but the heart purpose behind it. It's very clear in the Sermon on the Mount as Jesus deals with it. So, McGarvey again says, they spoke on the authority of Moses or the elders, but Jesus taught by his own authority. Their way was to quote minute precedents supported by endless authorities. Contrast that with the oft-repeated, I say unto you. That's what Jesus says over and over again in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus said their traditions resulted in vain worship. Why? Because they're just doing what what's always been done. They're not doing it because God asked for it. They're doing it because that's the way we always did it. I'm trying to think of anything around here that might illustrate it. I'll give you one that I learned early on picking Teresa up after worship, because I would come through this way. And you'd be amazed how many people say, that's not the right way to go. And I was like, why not? Nobody else is here. There's nobody here to care. Why can't I pull in this way? Because she gets in on the door on that side, So anyway, that's a tradition. Is it good or bad? Well, it's when everybody's coming in, it's good because we're all going to go the same way and we're going to keep the traffic funneling. But when everybody's gone from here, if you want to pull in the other way, what difference does it make? Is the answer. Their traditions, of course, were much more serious and dangerous because of that. Jesus' death, in part, would be because of the scribes. Jesus himself says that. Matthew 16:21. You see it again in Matthew 20, verse 18. Jesus condemned their hypocrisy. He recognized their authority in expounding the law, but not their example. Do what they say, Jesus basically says, not what they do. Because they say it, but they don't do it. And there's the problem. Their traditions bound heavy burdens on the people. Jesus talks about that in Matthew 23, verse 4. He said they loved attention from men. They loved to be praised by men. That's Matthew 23, 5 through 12. And if you're following me, that's that chapter where he goes, woe unto you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites. Jesus does that over and over and over again in that chapter. Why? This is part of why. Because they love the praise of men. You're really supposed to love the praise of God, not the praise of men. So, very important to see that. The Lord said they made a mockery of the real spirit of following God and led others to do the same. And there's the real danger of a false teacher. A false teacher is going to lead people in the wrong direction. So now let's look at the Pharisees. Again, if you look in the Old Testament, you will not find a single Pharisee mentioned. There's not one in the Old Testament. So how did they come to be? Well, let me give you a little bit of history here. When Mattathias unfurled the banner of revolt against the heathenizing policy of Antiochus Epiphanes, he was joined before long by a class calling themselves Assyrians. That's according to 1 Maccabees 2, verse 42. Let me pause a minute. I don't quote Maccabees as scripture, but 1 Maccabees is tremendous history. If you want to read for the history, 1 Maccabees is good. Who is Antiochus Epiphanes? Well, he ruled the Hellenist Seleucid Empire starting in 175 BC. Okay, everybody's going, Seleucid Empire? What's that? Well, here's what happened. If anybody in here ever heard of a fellow by the name of Alexander the Great? Alexander the Great died at age 32. He'd already virtually conquered the world, which is remarkable within itself, except for one thing. He's God's instrument. How do I know that? Book of Daniel. Yeah, just check it out. He's actually mentioned in one form or another, in 2 chapters in Daniel. He's mentioned in a sense of the word in Daniel chapter 2, but he comes back up in Daniel chapter 7, where it's much more vivid. It portrays him as just almost flying across the ground. He would make a wonderful driver in Mississippi on the interstate. But at any rate, that is Alexander the Great. Died at age 32. He had really 5 generals, and when he died, they basically divided the Greek Empire into 5 parts, but one of them kind of dissolved. and ended up merged with the other. Now we have 4. And then of the 4, 2 become dominant. One is the Ptolemies, and that's spelled with a P, P-T, Ptolemies. And the Ptolemies ruled in the area around Egypt. The other is the Seleucids, the ones I just talked about. They ruled in the area around Assyria. So you got Egypt in the south, you got Assyria in the north. Who's right in between? Israel. And so if you study your world history as it relates to, it's going to be related, by the way, in the book of Daniel very thoroughly. You'll see the Seleucids going down to attack the Ptolemies in Egypt. You see the Ptolemies coming up out of Egypt to attack the Seleucids. And every time they go through Israel, they tear up Jack. Every time they do it. That's the history of what's going on. Well, unfortunately, Antiochus Epiphanes was a violent man. He did lots of damage to the people of God. And finally, the Jews rebelled against him, led by a fellow by the name of Mattathias, and then also a fellow named that they called Judas the Hammer, also Judas Maccabeus, because that's really where that name comes from. They protested against their countrymen who were becoming increasingly infected by heathen customs, describing the Hellenizing faction as the impious, the lawless, and the transgressors. And I gave you a whole bunch of references from First Maccabees, and you're all saying, we don't have that book. Guess what? You can go online and find it for free anytime you want to. It's right there. If you want to read the history, again, it's not Bible, but it's good history. If you want to know the history, this is your place. First Maccabees. The name Assyrians means the pious, which well describes their strict observance to the law. After the Maccabees triumphed, the tenets of the Assyrians rapidly gained ground and received their complete development in those of the Pharisees from Parashin, to separate the separatists, who are also first distinctly mentioned during the time of the high priest Jonathan in BC 145. So now you got them coming along. Initially they're Assyrians, but they come to be known as the separatists, and then out of that name they get a nickname, if you would, Pharisee. And if you think about the Pharisees in the New Testament, guess what? They are kind of sticklers, aren't they? They do tend to separate from folks. And they want people to follow our rules. You'll write down the line. You'll see them do that numerous times. So it fits, if you would. After, the New Testament, Josephus and the rabbinic literature agree in characterizing the Pharisees as those most concerned with the accurate interpretation of the law and with promoting their own tradition. Josephus gives their number in the first century as 6,000 and attributes to them the greatest influence of any party on the common people. And if you want a really good book on backgrounds of early Christianity, you couldn't go wrong with Everett Ferguson. He's going to give you good information. Originally, these men were genuine patriots and reformers, but afterwards, the majority of them became formalists. It was all about form. Be sure you're wearing the right color shoes or whatever. It would be the way it would be for us. So who took their place as being, the great patriots? The zealots. And are there any zealots in the New Testament? Yes. In fact, Jesus has got an apostle called Simon Zelotes. He's a zealot. Now, if you want to find an interesting little twist in the New Testament, try this on. Zealots were sworn, basically, to kill all the tax collectors, because the tax collectors were people from Israel, who had they felt like had betrayed the nation because they were collecting taxes for the Romans. So they swore they were going to kill all of them. Guess what Matthew is? A tax collector. So you got Simon Zelotes is one of the apostles of the Lord, along with Matthew, the tax collector. So does the Lord bring about peace? I'd say they illustrate that he does. That's exactly what he does. That's a little side note. I threw that in for free, so whatever. Just something I've stumbled on as I've thought about all of this. The Pharisees believed, number one, in the resurrection of the dead. Number two, a future state with rewards and punishments. Number three, angels and spirits. Number four, a special providence of God carried out by angels and spirits. Now, McGarvey's one related that. If you think about it, they pretty much match us on those matters. Now, I'm not saying they agree with us on everything, but they would on most of those things. While they had great zeal for Moses' law, they were especially known for their rigorous interpretation of its precepts and doctrines, mainly guided by oral tradition, the tradition of the elders. And that's found in Matthew chapter 15, verse 2, and Mark chapter 7, verse 3. This supplementary written material was supposed to have been received by Moses on Sinai, passed on to Joshua, then the elders, followed by the prophets, and then the men of the great synagogue. That's the way that's supposed to have gone on. Now, let me warn you, there's a religious group today in the United States that's done the same thing with Christianity. Their tradition means more than the Word of God. And I can show you in their own writings where they say that. So you got to be really careful. It's fine to have traditions as long as we understand that if this is not bound by the Word of God, it's not bound. That you're allowed to do it some other way is if it's just a human tradition. Now, there is a God-given tradition. That would be a different story. As exponents of the law, they attached an undue importance to the outward act as compared to the inward spirit and motive. They were rigorous in exacting every external ceremony, especially in reference to washings, fastings, tithes, and alms. Were noted for pride and austerity. Now, I want you to think about some of the Pharisees' questions of Jesus. For example, why don't your disciples fast? See, the Pharisees were big on fasting. Test that. When Jesus tells the story or the parable of the publican and the Pharisee that went up to the temple to worship, what does the Pharisee say? He basically says, God, you ought to be real thankful you've got me. I fast twice in the week. I give tithes of all that I possess. I'm better than in fact, I'm better than this old publican over here. Now that's the Pharisee approach. Very proudful, very, very focused on their particular requirements. So they were big on pushing that kind of a thing, and you see it in various ways. What about this one? When they talked about to Jesus about your disciples are eating with unwashed hands. See, that's just a Pharisee tradition. Now, my mother had the same tradition. I don't know if she was a Pharisee or not, but don't eat with unwashed hands. For them, that was a ceremonial thing more than it was a cleanliness type of thing. It was ceremonial, and that's the Pharisees. That's where they come from. They placed a heavy emphasis on the externals. You could look at like Matthew chapter 12, and I think we got enough time to glance at one or two of these. Matthew chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. Watch them emphasize the externals as they talk to Jesus on that occasion. At the same time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." well, Jesus is pretty good about knowing the law. And he says, well, what about David? You know, David ate the bread, the showbread. What about that? You know, and they didn't have an answer for that. Jesus indicated finally that the man was not made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath was made for man. And you had to understand that, you know, in order to really appreciate it. Why was it okay for them to pluck heads of grain and to eat? Because it's okay to eat on the Sabbath. It's just not okay to work. So if they'd been out there with a sickle, you know, cutting down all the grain, that would have been a violation of the Sabbath law. But just getting a handful of grain and rubbing it and eating it, not really. Not according to the Lord. And I'd say he knows more about it than I do. You know, so I'm going to yield to him. Their tradition was more important to them than Moses' law. Look at chapter 15, where that comes clear in Matthew again. As we go along there, start at verse 1. Then the scribes and Pharisees who were from Jerusalem came to Jesus, saying, why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat bread. He answered and said to them, why do you also transgress the commandment of God because of your tradition? Do you notice the difference there? The Pharisees are concerned about what? The traditions of the elders. What's Jesus concerned about? The traditions of God. Now, you say, well, God doesn't give traditions. Oh, yeah, he does. A tradition is just something handed down from one generation to the next. That's all it is. And so when we hand the law to our children, when we teach them about Jesus and about the Bible, we're passing on a tradition. It's exactly what we're doing. So there is a tradition of God, tradition of man that we could look at. One's right, that's the tradition of God. One's wrong. For God commanded, saying, honor your father and your mother, and he who curses father or mother, let him be put to death. But you say, whoever says to his father or mother, whatever profit you might have received from me is a gift to God, then he need not honor his father or mother. Thus you've made the commandment of God of no effect by your tradition. I'm not going to go on and read the rest, but I want you to think about it. How would that be in, let's say right here at Sywell Road, all right? Here's how that would work. If somebody in here, some member of the church, had a mom and a dad or a mom or a dad, could be mom dead or dad's dead, we don't know. But if they were here worshiping together, and mom was a widow and she was starving to death, and the son or the daughter knows it's my responsibility to take care of mama, but here's what they say. You know, I would love to take care of your needs, Mom, but I've got to give my contribution Sunday. And what I would have done to help you, it's going to all be in the contribution. Kind of makes Mom, you know, what's she going to say? She ends up looking like a heel. If she says, but son, I'm starving to death, you know, makes her look bad. Well, Jesus says it's a violation of the will of God. Now, I'm going to propose to you that if you line up enough principles that you're going to discover Jesus would not say, don't give your tithe, which was true under the law of Moses. We don't do tithes today. Somebody's asked that. We're going to have a series of questions one Sunday night, and I'm going to talk about tithing. Why do we not tithe? Well, we ought to do more than tithe. I'll just leave it at that for right now. But not going to talk about it per se tonight. But the tithing, Jesus would have them do that, but also take care of mom and dad. You know, you're supposed to do both, not just one or the other. And Paul talks somewhat about that in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 8, when he says the one that doesn't provide for his own family has denied the faith and is worse than an infidel. That's the way he responds to that idea. And so their emphasis on tradition, definitely not right. They stress the keeping of the law in the smallest things while neglecting the weightier matters. They made sure you tithed uh, the little seeds, the spices, anise, cumin. I think is the way they say that. But anyway, they would literally sit down with a knife and divide. 9 for me, 1 for God. 9 for me, 1 for God. And they're dividing up little dill seeds. It's the kind of idea that they're doing, dividing all that up. They'd do that, but then they would do what? They wouldn't take care of their mama when she had need. There's something wrong with that. And that's what Jesus indicates in Matthew chapter 23. Luke chapter 6, the Pharisees had a real problem with the miracles of Jesus. Now, would anybody care to tell me why you think they had a particular problem with the miracles of Jesus? Anybody ever read Peter's sermon in Acts 2? It's because the miracles would prove he's the Son of God. And they couldn't afford to agree with that because they'd lose their power, they thought. And so they would pick at those miracles every chance they got. So look at Luke, for example. Luke chapter 6, that's one incident where that takes place, starting in verse 6 of that chapter. Here's what we find. Now it happened on another Sabbath also that he entered the synagogue and taught. And a man was there whose right hand was withered. So the scribes and Pharisees watched him closely, whether he would heal on the Sabbath, that they might find an accusation against him. But he knew their thoughts and said to the man who had the withered hand, "Arise and stand here." And he arose and stood. Jesus said to them, "I will ask you one thing. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil? To save life or to destroy?" Well, they're not going to answer that question. No way. Because he's getting ready to do something good, and they're going to have a problem with it. So, and when he looked around at them all, he's waiting for somebody to answer. Does this sound like an auditorium class on Wednesday night? Well, never mind. I just thinking. I don't know. But anyway, he looked around at them all. He said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And he did so, and his hand was restored as whole as the other. But they were filled with rage and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. Notice that? Not filled with awe because he just restored a man's hand. They're filled with rage because he worked a miracle on the Sabbath day. And they really ignore the miracle and focus on he's working. That's the way they viewed it. So that's one case. The other one, I'm not going to read all that, but in Matthew chapter 12 and in Mark chapter 3, you may remember that Jesus casts a demon out of a man. And when he does, how do they respond? Again, everybody present knew that guy had a demon. Everybody present knew that it made him do things that he wouldn't normally do himself, that nobody would. But when Jesus casts him out and that man is whole, he's sitting there well, what's their response? Well, the only way you can do that is because the devil gives you power to do it. That's their answer. They call him Beelzebub, but that's the prince of the demons. Who would that be? That's the devil. That's who it is. Now, it's out of that Jesus then says every kind of blasphemy is going to be forgiven, even blasphemy against the Father and against the Son, but not the blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. And somebody says, why did that come up? Well, Mark tells us, he gives an inspired answer to that. Because they said. He's casting out demons by Beelzebub. So what conclusion do I draw from that? Now remember, what I say, inference is a part of the inductive method. What's the inference? How did Jesus cast out the demon? By the power of the Holy Spirit. And they attributed that power to the devil. Pretty interesting. That's the Pharisees. The divorce, John 9 is them again. Pharisees struggle to find a way to explain the restoration of the blind man's sight. They even cast the blind man who is now healed, they threw him out of the synagogue. We don't need any evidence around here that Jesus is the Son of God, that's for sure. And so they threw him out. Matthew 19, they come to Jesus with a great question about divorce. And you might think, why would they do that? Because there were two schools of rabbinical thought. I've got them both listed here. Hillel allowed divorce for any cause. She burns the biscuits, you can divorce her. That's Hillel. Shimei, on the other hand, says you can only divorce her for sexual immorality. Now, both of them are looking at Deuteronomy chapter 24. That's where they're picking that up from. And that's where they're getting their argument from. Jesus stressed what? The original marriage design from Matthew chapter 2. He says, basically, not using quite these words, God made the law for marriage in the beginning, and it hadn't changed since. That's what he basically says. And that's his answer to them. So, that's the Pharisees. Now, the Sadducees. Sadducees were the party of the wealthy priests and their friends in the aristocracy. And you see that in Acts 5, of course. They combined conservative religious attitudes with power politics. They rejected the Pharisees' innovations, and their interpretation was stricter than those of the Pharisees. That's kind of interesting, isn't it? They're really socialites and power-hungry politicians, but they're stricter on the law than the Pharisees are. Kind of remarkable, but true. The Sadducees control the temple ritual. They may be characterized as both conservative and compliant. Conservative, yes, conservative in reference to the law, compliant in reference to Rome. Why? Because they don't want to lose power. That's why. So they're going to go along to get along so they can keep their office, keep their power, if you would. After the coming of Rome, they encouraged collaboration with the ruling power and were interested in maintaining the status quo, which preserved the peace and their power and their influence. Their center of strength was the temple. And so you'll see them most often there. If you really watch the Pharisees, they're going to be close to the temple. So, for example, Acts chapter 3, what happens? Peter and John come up to the temple gate beautiful. They see a lame man, been lame for 40 years. They heal the lame man, and guess who gets all worked up about it? Sadducees. Now, not exclusively, but they're the primaries. And you see them in Acts 4, they bring them before who? The chief priests. See, that's where the Sadducees came. The chief priests came from the Sadducees. Let me reverse my statement. I'm trying to get that correct there. So that's the Sadducees. Matthew 3, they came to John when he was preaching and baptizing in the wilderness. He described them as a brood of vipers, which is, that's kind of strong, but extremely poisonous snake. He said, who warned you to flee? The reference is to escaping destruction. However, it could not be accomplished by ritualistic baptism. That's the way the Sadducees would have tried to do it. Instead, their lives must bear the fruit of the change such submission suggests. Have you ever thought about this? If you were baptized and your life didn't change, then you really weren't baptized. Just think about it. You didn't really submit to Jesus if your life didn't change. That's my point. And the Sadducees believed in a cleansing, but they didn't really change the heart. So they got a problem there. Apparently, they relied on their being children of Abraham and getting an automatic entrance into the Messianic kingdom. All Jews are going to get in free. It's kind of the idea. God was ready to cut down the fruitless tree, according to John. What about their relationship with Jesus? Well, Matthew 16, they came seeking a sign. Jesus marveled at it just a little bit, and I want you to think about why. He says, you all can read the weather like a book. Now, how do they do it? You've heard the old saying, hadn't you? Red sky at night, sailors delight. Red sky at morning, sailors take warning. Hey, by the way, would everybody in here please pray for a red sky at morning? Just start now, because we need it, big time. Let's get some rain around here. That's my theory. So pray for red sky at morning. But anyway, you can read the weather, but you can't know who I am. Why not? Did they not have the signs? Had he not shown who he was by the miracles they were? The answer's obvious. They could have read the sign. So he says, there's not going to be any sign given to you except the sign of the prophet Jonah. Jonah what? He was in the belly of the whale. How long? 3 days, 3 nights. How long would Jesus be in the grave? 3 days, 3 nights. Did the Sadducees believe it? They did not, even though Jesus told them. Jesus warned about their leavening influence later in the same chapter. Jesus cited a passage from the Pentateuch in Matthew 22 to answer their argument. They didn't believe in the resurrection. He said, well then, why does God say, what did he say to Moses? Exodus chapter 3, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. I am, is that present, past, or future tense? Present. So if he am, and I know that's not good grammar, I get it. If he am the God of Abraham, is Abraham still alive? That's Jesus' implication. That's what he says. Yeah, he's still alive. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, they're all still alive. When? Exodus 3. How long have they been dead? 400 years, roughly. Abraham, about 400 years. But he's still alive. Ooh. Then there must be an afterlife. There must be a spirit world. That's what Jesus is arguing. And guess what? Did you notice what he did? He used their own books to beat them. He went right to their book. They liked Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Where did he go for his quote? Exodus. Straight to their book and said, look here. I think that's a pretty good argumentation myself. So Acts 23:8 indicates they did not believe in angels or spirits, but angels were actually active in the Pentateuch. And so you've got like the angel of the Lord who comes to Moses, for instance. Now, I think the angel of the Lord was Jesus, but we'll talk about that some other time. It might be they did not go along with the extensive beliefs of the Pharisees about angels and demons. Acts chapter 4, we mentioned that a while ago. They took Peter and John into custody following the healing of the lame man and preaching about Jesus' resurrection. Acts 5, they seized all the apostles because of jealousy. Acts 22, you bless his heart, Paul knew how to set the Sanhedrin on their ear. And it didn't take much at all. All he had to do was to say, I am on trial today because I am a Pharisee. And I believe in the resurrection. And the Sadducees all went, hang him. And the Pharisees all went, hey, let's calm down. Let's listen to him. This guy might have something good to say. Paul knows exactly how to work that crowd. Why? Because he's from them. So, do you now see how knowing a little bit of background helps you understand the New Testament and even the Old Testament, but the New Testament better? Helps open up windows to you if you just know the background. Thank you very much. Next week, we really will go to consider the words. I was supposed to do that today, but Drew's given me 2 more weeks, so I expanded just a little bit. So, thank you.